My wife is sitting next to me, and on her knee is Anna Eleanor Dow, our oldest grandchild, and then comes my daughter, Anna Dow, and on her lap, Buzzy, and then comes my mother. And behind me is my boy, Franklin Jr., James, our oldest boy, and then John, and then Curtis Dow.
March 4th, 1933. A dismal, sullen day, matching the mood of the people gathered in Washington to witness the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Caught in the grip of a paralyzing depression, the nation has lost faith in its government and in itself. Franklin Roosevelt knows that these people will do anything if only someone will tell them what to do.
This is a day of national consecration, and I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This nation is asking for action, and action now.
The words, the sure, smiling confidence of the president bring a new surge of hope to the hundreds of thousands in Washington, to the millions across the United States. Throughout the nation, he is hailed as the champion of the common man. Yet, in his own life, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had always been isolated from the common man. Born in 1882 at Hyde Park, New York, Franklin Roosevelt spends his childhood amid wealth and luxury. Parents James and Sarah Delano Roosevelt educate their son at home, determined to raise him in a genteel, aristocratic tradition. But when he's 14 years old, young Franklin is enrolled at exclusive Groton School. Later, as a Harvard student, he divides his time between studying and rounds of Boston society parties. In 1905, he marries a fifth cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. I will be, he earnestly tells a friend, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Governor of New York, and then the President. Young Roosevelt supports Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign in 1912. When Wilson is elected, Roosevelt receives an appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. A canny politician warns, you know the Roosevelts. Whenever a Roosevelt rides, he wishes to ride in front. The job delights Roosevelt, who has always loved boats, sailing, and the sea. Roosevelt supervises the Navy buildup when America enters World War I. He gambles on radical new ideas and worries conservative engineers by saying, try it and we'll see what happens. I get my fingers into everything, he writes his wife. And in Washington, he makes invaluable political contacts. He isn't a deep thinker, says one official, but he's intelligent and learns quickly. In 1920, the Democrats nominate James Cox, Ohio's governor, as their presidential candidate. He chooses for his running mate Franklin Roosevelt. The Roosevelt name still has strong voter appeal, and it pleases FDR that many people mistake him for Teddy's son. In his vigorous cross-country campaign, Roosevelt concentrates on international issues. he wins attention, but few votes. When a Republican administration sweeps to power in 1920, Franklin Roosevelt returns to the kind of life his parents envisioned for him. With Eleanor and their 5 children, he spends leisurely summer days at Campobello, swimming and sailing. But as much as he enjoys being with his family, he still longs for the excitement of public office. And through the summer of 1921, he keeps up a steady correspondence with important Democratic leaders. Suddenly, he is stricken by polio. Franklin Roosevelt's legs are paralyzed. The paralysis crushes Roosevelt's dreams, his hopes for a career in politics. But his wife, Eleanor, gently, patiently urges him not to give up. At Warm Springs, Georgia, Roosevelt undertakes a strenuous program of physical therapy. He slowly regains strength in his legs, and the improvement fills him with new hope, new enthusiasm. The 1928 Democratic Convention. Franklin Roosevelt makes a dramatic return to politics. In a rousing speech, he nominates for president the man he calls the Happy Warrior, Al Smith. During Smith's colorful campaign, Roosevelt remains in the background. He's convinced that the Happy Warrior cannot win. Late in September of 1928, however, Smith virtually forces Roosevelt into the battle by presenting him with the Democratic nomination for governor of New York. Well, if I've got to run, says Roosevelt, there's no use worrying about it. And he undertakes a strenuous tour throughout New York State. 8 is a Republican year, but Roosevelt wins a hairbreadth victory. On January 1st, 1929, he achieves another of the goals he had set for himself 20 years before. He becomes governor of New York State. For Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governorship becomes a springboard. I believe, he tells a friend, I can be nominated for the presidency in 1932. For 3 years, Roosevelt travels around the country, making friends of influential political leaders.
Colonel, it's been a great delight to be with you and these distinguished friends of mine today, and I wish very much that I could come down here this summer instead of having to spend the summer in the hot capital of the state of New York.
We have a feeling that you shouldn't continue to come here as governor. You should come in a more exalted capacity. And so we're looking forward to welcoming you as president sometime within the next 2 years.
The 1932 Democratic Convention. No matter who we nominate, says one party leader, he'll win. But Franklin Roosevelt is the most dramatic personality we have.
Franklin D. Roosevelt, having received more than 2/3 of all the delegates voting, I proclaim him the nominee of this convention for President of the United States.
Jubilant Democrats proclaim happy days are here again. A hurried plane trip brings Roosevelt to the convention. He breaks a long-standing tradition, appearing in person to accept the nomination.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
The Depression is the only issue in the 1932 election campaign. 11 million Americans are without jobs. Families are without food, without clothing, without homes. The nation is without hope. During the campaign, Roosevelt bitterly attacks the Hoover administration.
Now, let's be frank. You and I know that immediate relief of the unemployed is the immediate need of the hour. The present leadership in Washington stands convicted, not because it did not have the means to plan, but fundamentally because it did not have the will to do.
Roosevelt is a tireless campaigner who draws enthusiastic audiences wherever he goes. He pleases the crowds, writes one observer, but he speaks in generalities and seems to have no concrete program, just a collection of vague proposals. But Roosevelt's electrifying personality dominates the campaign. On Election Day, the Democratic Party behind Franklin Roosevelt is swept into power. His victory is a gratifying personal triumph, but he knows that now he must somehow find the means to stir the productive machinery of America back to life, to lead a frightened and bewildered nation out of the depths of a crushing depression. No president has ever faced a greater challenge. The nation, President Roosevelt has said, wants action now. And with incredible speed, the New Deal swings into operation. Banks are failing, their ready cash wiped out by a run of frightened depositors. Roosevelt closes down the banks. Then he rushes emergency banking legislation through Congress. Roosevelt explains the meaning of the new law in the first of his fireside chats.
The bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. No sound bank is $1 worse off than it was when it closed its doors. I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress.
There are other crises in the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration. Hard-pressed farmers man barricades to stop foreclosure on their land. The Agricultural Adjustment Act gives them money to save their farm and assures them a fair price for their crops. For the unemployed, federal work projects begin. And if the planning is hasty, no one cares. It doesn't matter how it turns out in the long run, says one official. People don't eat in the long run, they eat every day. A thirsty nation happily greets the signing of the beer bill, the end of prohibition. The creation of the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, caps the first 100 days of Roosevelt's first term. A giant parade through New York City celebrates the founding of this gigantic cooperative movement. The Blue Eagle symbolizes the NRA, and the thousands of people rallying behind this banner seem to typify the new spirit, the new vigor flowing through the entire nation. People, the newspapers, even his enemies cheer Roosevelt's efforts. He is the spearhead, they say, of this new awakening. worst 100 days are over. Hastily constructed laws rammed through Congress have met the emergency. The upswing has begun. Now, for the first time in more than a year, the president relaxes. He returns to Warm Springs, Georgia at Thanksgiving time. Here he has helped found a treatment center for victims of infantile paralysis. To these youngsters, he is a special source of inspiration.
And the first thing we do is to distribute the spinach, which you're all so fond of. And then we proceed to do that. And then at last, we get busy and we commit murder.
On Election Day, 1936, the New Deal reaches its crest of popularity and prestige. In Times Square, a cheering crowd greets the news that FDR has been re-elected by the greatest majority in history. Inauguration Day, 1937. The president scorns a closed car for the parade following the inauguration. If the people can take it, he says, so can I. But as Roosevelt starts his second term, the slapdash nature of the emergency measures passed back in 1933 begins to haunt the president. The Supreme Court rules that vital pieces of New Deal legislation, like the NRA, are unconstitutional. Roosevelt bitterly denounces the actions of the court.
The Democratic administration and the Congress made a gallant, sincere effort to raise wages, to reduce hours, to abolish child labor, and to eliminate unfair trade practices. And what happened? You know who assumed the power to veto and did veto that program. If we would make democracy succeed, I say we must act now.
Now, Roosevelt resolves to change the makeup of the Supreme Court. Mulling over a number of plans, he hits on this suggestion. For every judge over the age of 70, an additional judge shall be appointed to the court to help lighten the workload. The answer to a maiden's prayer, says Roosevelt. Most of the 9 judges are over 70. If he can push this suggestion through Congress, it will enable Roosevelt to appoint as many as 6 new judges to the court, and perhaps swing the balance in favor of the New Deal. A Democratic-controlled Congress rebels against the president. Senators publicly debate the issue.
I shall not be a party to breaking down the checks and balances of the Constitution in the absence of a mandate from the people to that effect.
I do not think that any person who has confidence in the President of the United States will believe for one moment that he was urged by a desire to pack the Supreme Court of the United States in his personal interest.
I am opposed to packing the court for the purpose of controlling its constitutional decisions, whether by the President or by anybody else.
What do they mean by the words packing the Supreme Court? Let me answer this question with a bluntness that will end all honest misunderstanding of my purpose. If by that phrase, packing the court, it is charged that I wish to place on the bench spineless puppets who would disregard the law and would decide specific cases as I wished them to be decided, I make this answer, that no president fit for his office would appoint, and no Senate of honorable men fit for their office would confirm that kind of appointees to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Roosevelt fails in his effort to get support in Congress. Roosevelt accepts the defeat philosophically, I haven't a care in the world, he writes. And he goes on, which is going some for a president who is said to be a remorseless dictator driving his country into bankruptcy. At a political dinner, the president issues a warning to balky Democrats using the brogue of an Irish politician.
And if we Democrats lay for each other now, we can be sure that in 1940, that will be the corner where the American people will be laying for all of us.
But Roosevelt refuses to announce his plans for the 1940 election. Many Democratic leaders are fearful that he may want to break the long-standing tradition that a president serve only 2 terms. Spring 1940. A tired Franklin Roosevelt tries to relax. The grueling years of fighting the Depression have taken their toll. I have to have a rest, he tells a friend. I want to go home and stay there. But he is concerned about the war in Europe, and he is being pressed for a decision on whether he will seek a 3rd term. You can't quit, a friend tells FDR. The war will be coming over here, and you'll wind up wondering why you gave up a job that only you can handle. Unable to decide, Roosevelt stalls for time. July 15, 1940. The Democratic Convention meets in Chicago. The delegates are bewildered by FDR's silence. One party leader wires the White House. "Tell us what to do," he says. "This convention is bleeding to death." Finally, after 2 days of confusion, Senator Alben Barkley reads a puzzling message from the White House.
The President has never had, and has not today, any desire or purpose to continue in the office of President, to be a candidate for that office, or to be nominated by the convention for that office. He wishes in all earnestness and sincerity to make it clear that all of the delegates to this convention are free to vote for any candidate.
As stunned delegates try to read some hidden meaning into the statement, a single strident voice roars out of the loudspeakers.
We want Roosevelt! We want Roosevelt! We want Roosevelt! We want
The convention stampedes, and Roosevelt is nominated by acclamation. FDR makes his acceptance speech from the White House by radio.
It is with a very full heart that I speak tonight. I must confess that I do so with mixed feelings, because I find myself in a conflict between deep personal desire for retirement on the one hand, and that quiet, invisible thing called conscience on the other.
FDR attends to his official duties during the first weeks of the campaign. He hopes to straddle the fence on the war issue, to satisfy both isolationists and interventionists. But there is harrowing news from Europe. The English ambassador brings Prime Minister Churchill's desperate plea for help. Hitler is massing troops in France for the invasion of England. Now, FDR makes a crucial decision. On September 3rd, 1940, FDR stuns the nation by announcing that he is giving the British Navy 50 destroyers. But he has acted without consulting Congress. Democratic leaders assure FDR has committed political suicide. Wendell Willkie, the Republican presidential candidate, lashes out at FDR. He calls the president's move the most dictatorial and arbitrary act of any president in the history of the United States. FDR is stung by Wilkie's assault. He tells an aide, "Now I'm fighting mad."
I consider it a public duty to answer falsifications with facts. I will not pretend that I find this an unpleasant duty. I am an old campaigner, and I love a good fight.
Determined to make every speech a blockbuster, he turns the campaign into a spectacular display of political oratory.
We know, if we but look at the record, that American business, big and small business, is way up above the level of 1932 and on a much sounder footing than it was even in the 20s.
When he ran for re-election 4 years ago, there were in America 9,400,000 unemployed. Today, there are 9,600,000 unemployed. Franklin Roosevelt doesn't know how, doesn't know what it means to either work with your hands or how to produce things so that other men can work.
The Republican Party, through its leadership, played politics with defense of the United States in 1938 and 1939. And they are playing politics with the national security of America today.
If his promise to keep our boys out of foreign wars is no better than his promise to balance the budget, they're already almost on the transports.
We will not participate in foreign wars, and we will not send our army, naval, or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas, except in case of attack.
I call each of you to this cause, the greatest cause that ever was offered to free people. Rally around. We cannot lose. We must win. We will win.
The American people will not be stampeded into panic. The effort failed before, and it will fail again.
FDR returns to Hyde Park on Election Day 1940. He spends the day with his family in warm, familiar surroundings. But beneath the confident smile lie nagging doubts about his re-election. With the world poised on the brink of war, will they ask someone else to lead them? By midnight, the trend is clear. Roosevelt will win election to an unprecedented third term. It is November 1940, and in the dawn of a new crisis, the people have turned again to Franklin Delano Roosevelt for leadership.
There is a great storm raging now, a storm that makes things harder for the world. Our future belongs to us Americans. It is for us to design it, for us to build it, and we will make it. We will make it, and the world, we hope, will make it too.
Inauguration Day, 1941. Roosevelt assumes the cares and burdens of a nation on the verge of war. FDR has no illusions. Personally, he is convinced that within the next 4 years, the United States will have to fight. Thousands of men are being called into the Army each month under the new Selective Service Act. But young draftees fight mock battles with make-believe weapons. The United States is totally unprepared for war. In Washington, interventionists picket the White House, and isolationists picket the interventionists. By fall of 1941, Roosevelt has done everything he can to prepare the country for the conflict he knows is inevitable. His hands are tied, writes a reporter. Now the initiative is passed to our enemies. If there is to be a war, they will have to start it. Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull carry on crucial negotiations with the Japanese. They have demanded that Japan halt her aggression against China. But Japanese diplomats will not say what their government intends to do. Even at Hyde Park, Roosevelt cannot escape the tensions of the international situation. He tries to spend as much time as he can with his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt, whose health is failing. FDR's devotion to her is deep. He often laughingly calls himself a mama's boy. In September, Sarah Roosevelt dies. Grief-stricken, Roosevelt looks to a future filled with foreboding. Perhaps Mother died at the right time, he tells his wife. She would not like the kind of world that is coming. November 26, 1941. A special Japanese envoy and Ambassador Nomura leave the State Department with a final American peace proposal. They refuse to comment on the proposal. They have already been secretly informed by their government that war cannot be avoided. Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Cordell Hull rushes to the White House. Shocking news has reached Washington. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. December 8th. Crowds gather in front of the Capitol building in Washington. They wait for the president to arrive for an emergency session of Congress. Once again, they look to FDR for confidence, for reassurance. Roosevelt's doubts, his uncertainty are gone. Now, at last, he can take action.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
December 1941. The flames of the Second World War have finally engulfed the United States.
Nobody knows when total victory would come, but we do know that the harder we fight now, the more might and power that we direct at the enemy now, the shorter the war will be and the smaller the sum total of sacrifice. Now, it is your turn.
FDR spearheads the greatest mobilization in American history. Within a year, United States defense plants meet quotas experts have called impossible. Tehran, November 1943. Roosevelt attends his first meeting with Churchill and Stalin. Roosevelt is determined to win the friendship of Joseph Stalin. He feels that Stalin, a ruthless veteran of cutthroat diplomacy, will change his ways when confronted with American goodwill. Don't worry about Stalin, Roosevelt tells his aides. I can handle that old buzzard. Tehran produces two crucial decisions. The Western Allies decide to invade the continent of France the following spring, and Stalin will launch a new offensive from the east. FDR arrives home in time for Christmas at Hyde Park. He poses with his children and grandchildren in a scene reminiscent of happier pre-war days. But he sees little of his family now. FDR's sons are in the armed forces. His wife, Eleanor, is preoccupied with war work. For most of the year, the family home at Hyde Park is deserted. In the summer of 1944, the Democrats meet in Chicago to choose their presidential candidate. There is little doubt who it will be.
I present to this convention for the office of President of these United States one who is endowed with the intellectual boldness of Thomas Jefferson, the indomitable courage of Andrew Jackson, the faith and patience of Abraham Lincoln, the rugged integrity of Grover Cleveland, and the scholarly vision of Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Thomas Dewey, the Republican candidate, conducts a spirited campaign. The presidency, Republicans claim, is a job for a younger man. Pride is hurt. He pushes himself unnecessarily during his brief campaign. In New York, he makes a 51-mile tour of the city in an open car despite the cold and rain. FDR makes few campaign speeches, but when he does it with the old Roosevelt touch.
These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Fallon. You know, Fallon's Scotch. And being a Scotty, as soon as he learned that the Republican fiction writers in Congress and out had concocted a story that I'd left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer back to find him at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. He has not been the same dog since.
Predictably, the vote is a Roosevelt landslide. FDR has won a history-making fourth term.
And when I say a welcome home, I hope that some of the scribes in the papers won't intimate that I expect to make Washington my permanent residence for the rest of my life.
A changed Franklin Roosevelt begins his 13th year in the White House. His vitality is ebbing now. He suffers racking colds which last for months. FDR's lagging health is evident even in the newsreels.
Want glasses on?
If you please, sir.
The White House press staff tests special lighting effects to conceal his haggard appearance.
Mr. President, would you just give me one full profile? Would you just look full profile to your left, sir?
Exhaustion all but submerges the magic of Roosevelt's personality.
All right, thank you, sir.
All right. I can keep on looking at him, so.
No, we want you out here. Now, would you just try the glass off once more?
February 1945, Yalta, the second conference of the Big Three. The war in Europe is nearly over. A tired FDR presses for realization of his greatest dream, a United Nations organization to ensure the peace. Roosevelt accepts Stalin's word that the occupied nations of Eastern Europe will be given their independence after the war. Exhausted, but pleased by the Yalta talks, FDR returns home sure that he has seen the beginnings of a new spirit of international harmony.
Members of the Congress,
I hope that you will pardon me for an unusual posture of sitting down during the presentation of what I want to say. I know that you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me in not having to carry about 10 pounds of steel round on the bottom of my legs, and also because of the fact that I have just completed a 14,000-mile trip. Days were spent in discussing these momentous matters, and we argued freely and frankly across the table. But at the end, on every point, unanimous agreement was reached. And more important even than the agreement of words, I may say we had achieved a unity of thought and a way of getting along together.
But within months, communist tyranny in Poland and Romania shatters Roosevelt's illusions about the spirit of Yalta. The communists have begun to enslave virtually all of Eastern Europe. FDR is forced to recognize grave errors in his judgment. He begins to fear that he has not done enough to ensure post-war peace. FDR goes to Warm Springs, Georgia to rest and recuperate from a bad cold. Years ago, stricken by polio, Roosevelt came here to regain strength and confidence. Always before, the quiet, the sunshine, have renewed his vitality. Suddenly, a terse news bulletin stuns the world. FDR is dead. Day, Winston Churchill says, "To die at the height of a man's career, the highest moment of his effort, universally honored and admired, this is not the most unenviable of fates." The Roosevelt years are over.